Hey guys! So we are wrapping up this study of the Gilded Age, and the reason that I have on my shades is that we're going to be studying something super shady. And that is the way that political machines in the Gilded Age used corruption and bribery and all kinds of different schemes by which they controlled local, state, and then sometimes even national governments to their own benefit. And so the handout that goes with this is this handout right here. Wait, I forgot to write it up. Yeah, it says political machines in the middle of it, and we're going to be talking about how they got votes and how they got money, and how they eventually are exposed for all of their corruption and brought down in time by reformers. Okay, so let's turn to the PowerPoint. This one shouldn't be too long, actually, I don't think. We'll see if I can live up to that. I always make promises, don't I? Alright, so what you can see here is it says political machines, how they got money. But before we can move on to that, we need to just make sure you understand what a political machine is. So that's the definition, is what we're working at first in the upper right-hand corner of your graphic organizer. My definition of a political machine is somewhat like a gang of people who controlled city governments for their own profit and self-interest. So, you know, we have gangs today. They're mainly involved in prostitution and illegal drug sales to benefit themselves. In this case, this is a gang, but it's more like a legit gang in that they don't control illegal drug sales and prostitution. Instead, they control local government. They get elected, and we'll talk about how, and then they use their government office to benefit themselves and their friends. Okay? The first thing they have to do, or one important aspect of the political machine, is to get money. And the first way they do that is something called graft, or padding bills. So what they do is they tell the taxpayers that something needs to be built. That's one way that they can do it. And then they give their friends in construction the contract to build it. And then their friends overcharge the taxpayers to have it built. And then whatever money they overcharge, they then split that with the machine. The construction company gets half, and the political machine who controls city government or state government gets half. And that way they both benefit at the expense of the taxpayers. And the taxpayers are usually, they're counting on the taxpayers being so uneducated or so apathetic that they don't really question or care too much about where their taxpayer money is going, or they're intimidated by the machine and they don't want to ask too many questions lest they get in trouble. So there's a good aspect of fear that goes into the political machine structure as well. The second thing that they do is they do bribes, where government officials would accept bribes for licenses. So let's say if you needed a driver's license, they would bump you to the front of the line for an extra $60 or whatever. That would be an example of how you could bribe a government official. Maybe you were building something and you needed to pass inspection and you knew it wasn't up to code, and so you just paid the inspector not to notice that whatever you were building was not according to regulations. And the officials who receive these bribes, or the officials who receive the bribes, they would usually kick back some of the money to the political machine. And that way the political machine would make sure that those people stayed in those jobs. And so they would have job security as a result. I should add, by the way, this is a really important concept to understand, because this is where a lot of the countries we try and help get stuck, is in this like Gilded Age political machine corruption cycle. For example, we're trying to help Afghanistan right now form a democracy, and they're stuck here. There's so much corruption going on in their society that it's really crippling their democracy. The same thing goes with Russia right now. Russia is trying to move towards democracy. And so the key for a successful democracy is how to get through this stage of corruption. And we are just lucky enough as a country to have had some reformers who really took this by the horns and pretty much solved it. So today we don't really worry about our government officials being, all of them being corrupt. But it takes a special stage of reform to conquer this kind of corruption and take that democracy to the next level. So this is still an issue that really hangs up a lot of countries, is how to fight and conquer this corruption problem within their own boundaries. All right, so the organizational structure. You have a party boss. If you remember in the movie Far and Away we looked at, there was that guy, Mr. Burke. He was kind of the party boss of Boston in that movie, where he had a spot on the town council and had a whole lot of power. If you remember Mike Kelly, the guy in the bar who owned the bar and ran the boxing matches, he was the ward boss, and that's why when he went into the, I guess I should call it the House of Ill Repute, he kept yelling, the kid in front of him kept yelling, "Ward boss, ward boss," and he gave a political speech there to the men because he was part of the political party and political machine structure. And then you have a precinct captain. Usually the precinct captain kind of does the dirty work or the bidding of the ward boss. And really that kid in Far and Away really served in that role where he arranged boxing matches and went and recruited people at the harbors to come see Mike Kelly and those kinds of things. And then you would have the common people like Joseph and Shannon. They were key to the political machine working because they relied upon them for their vote. If you remember Mike Kelly, when he saw Joseph, he said, "First we'll get you working, then we'll get you voting," he said, voting. So that's part of how they bribe the common people and control their vote. And then you also need the businessmen who want government contracts and who will engage in the bribery and the kickbacks and all of that kind of stuff to rip off the taxpayers. So that's how the organizational structure goes. The next thing they have to do is they have to get votes. The first way they get votes is, just like we saw in the movie, is they bribe immigrants who are recently into the country by giving them jobs and arranging their housing. And then they take them to vote. There is no secret ballot back then, so the immigrants can be very easily intimidated into voting for who they're told to vote for. And that's why the secret ballot will be an important reform to undermine the power of the political machines. If you couldn't get enough immigrants to intimidate into voting, you could always pad the voting lists or just commit out-and-out fraud. They would put dead people's names on the voting lists, or dogs, or imaginary people. And then they would have their people in the political machine go vote multiple times, like changing their hat or their coat if need be, and under some subterfuge voting multiple times. That's where there's this joke. We used to have strong political machines in Chicago. Some would say we still do. And they used to say, "Vote early and vote often." And that's the whole idea that people were voting more than once under different names. So an example of a famous political machine in the time period is Tammany Hall. It was the Democratic headquarters of New York City, and the political boss of New York City who served in Tammany Hall was Boss Tweed. This is a picture of him in this cartoon, and you can see that it says, "In counting there is strength," and the idea is that as long as Boss Tweed is counting the ballots, everybody's certain that the political machine will remain in power. And it says, the subtitle here is, "That's what's the matter." Basically the cartoonist here is pointing out that there's no hope of overthrowing the political machines as long as the political boss, Boss Tweed, is controlling how the votes are counted. So that's an important aspect of staying in power if you're a political boss. So eventually these political machines are going to get exposed, and a key person involved in that is this man pictured here. His name is Thomas Nast. He understands that the common people, most of them can't read and write, and so it's very important for them to understand how this corruption works, that he communicate with them visually. And so he's a cartoonist who exposed political machines through his drawings, not his writings. And since most poor people couldn't read well, he raised awareness among them of why political machines were bad. So you can see how directly, for example, this cartoon communicates. We have a fat guy, which means he's wealthy and powerful. And now instead of having a face, he just has a money bag for a face, which shows you that he's really all about the money. And he's getting to be a fat cat off of the wealth that he gains through public office. And he is Boss Tweed. The common people would recognize him as Boss Tweed. Okay, so that is political machines in a nutshell. It affected local and state governments all around the country during this time period, and so it's going to be really important that to get democracy to function and serve the citizens well, that we're going to need some reform. That reform does not happen during the Gilded Age. It's going to be in the next unit we study called progressivism. So right now it's just important that you understand the problem and the degree of corruption that existed in America. And then in the next unit we'll be talking about how to solve it. So just remember, this was the time of pretty shady dealings in American history, and it's going to be our job to figure out how to cast some light on those shady dealings and get our democracy straightened out. Okay, see you next time.